Message received. Enemy approaching Sector 4.
This fog won't hold them back for long. Prepare for engagement.
The American fleet is here, Admiral. We must strike now.
We cannot risk the carriers. Wait for the fog.
Agreed. Prepare the diversionary force.
Clear the deck for launch. Radio, confirm frequency. Confirmed. Channeling command.
January 17th, 1942. The early morning sun slices through a cold, gray haze over the waters north of the Solomon Islands. Mist clings to the horizon, softening the outlines of vessels that seem to float like ghosts. From the bridge of a Japanese cruiser, Captain Takeda squints against the glare, his breath visible in the chill. Ahead, dark shapes ripple across the sea. Ships moving in formation, far larger than expected, their silhouettes precise, disciplined. A signalman whispers the coded messages from the mast, and the officers exchange uneasy glances. Something feels off. The enemy's fleet appears too coordinated, too visible. Reports from scouts are conflicting. Radar confirms the presence of multiple groups, yet their movements lack the erratic unpredictability of a real combat fleet. Somewhere beyond the waves, unseen engines churn, hiding their true nature. American ingenuity has stretched across the ocean, crafting a deception so convincing that even experienced Japanese captains hesitate, questioning their reconnaissance, their instincts, the very intelligence they have relied upon. This moment, poised between uncertainty and revelation, will change the Pacific War forever. By early 1942, the Pacific was a theater of uncertainty and high stakes. Japan had seized momentum after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, pushing into Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific. Singapore had fallen, the Philippines were under siege, and Japanese carriers prowled the waters with near impunity. Across the ocean, the United States Navy was still reeling, regrouping, and recalibrating strategy after the devastating losses at Pearl Harbor. The Japanese Imperial Navy, confident in its numerical and tactical superiority, assumed that American forces were weakened and cautious. Japanese intelligence painted a picture of an adversary reluctant to risk its remaining capital ships in decisive engagement. From Tokyo to Truk Lagoon, plans are being drafted for further expansion. Captains and admirals alike operated under the belief that they had the initiative and that American movements could be anticipated. In reality, the United States was quietly transforming its approach. Task forces were being restructured, carriers were replenished, and new tactical doctrines were emerging. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet from Pearl Harbor, understood that direct confrontation with the seasoned Japanese Navy could be catastrophic if approached recklessly. Instead, he leaned on the advantage of unpredictability. Deception, feints, and carefully staged maneuvers would become crucial tools in the Pacific campaign. The technology of naval warfare was also shifting. Radar, still in its early stages, allowed American ships to detect movements beyond visual range. Radio communications were carefully monitored and, at times, deliberately manipulated to feed false information. Camouflage techniques, from netting to wooden decoy vessels, gave even smaller craft the ability to masquerade as formidable units. Every detail was a calculated effort to create illusions, to bend perception without firing a shot. Meanwhile, the Japanese had extended their reach too quickly. Logistics were strained, fuel was rationed, and reconnaissance aircraft were spread thin. Every engagement required certainty. Any misjudgment could lead to disaster. Intelligence reports were scrutinized, yet biases crept in. Experienced officers, confident in their ability to read the battlefield, often interpreted ambiguous data in ways that reinforced their expectations. When a distant fleet appeared unusually well organized, some officers assumed it was a real formation rather than a carefully constructed ruse. The psychological dimension of deception cannot be understated. In the war rooms of Tokyo, admirals made decisions based on partial reports and worst-case scenarios. Japanese captains were trained to value initiative and decisive action, but these traits could be exploited. By presenting the illusion of strength, mobility, and intent, American planners could provoke hesitation, misallocation of forces, or even outright retreat. Every false signal, every phantom vessel, became a tool in a silent game of nerves. By mid-January, a specific plan had begun to take shape. The U.S. Navy would stage decoy fleets in areas that the Japanese expected real strikes. Wooden hulls, empty destroyer frames, and simulated carrier decks would sail across the Pacific, supported by small escort ships and aircraft that maintained the illusion of operational presence. Radio chatter would be crafted to mimic standard fleet communications, and planes would mimic scouting patterns, suggesting strength where none existed. The goal was simple yet audacious: to manipulate Japanese perceptions, forcing commanders to commit resources based on deception rather than reality. This stage was the calm before the storm. On one side, Japanese officers relied on habit, experience, and intelligence reports. On the other, American planners relied on creativity, patience, and an understanding of psychology at sea. Both sides believed they held the advantage, yet only one would interpret the signals correctly. It was a high-stakes game of observation, anticipation, and misdirection, a game in which a single misstep could tip the balance of naval power across the Pacific. And so, as Japanese lookouts scanned the horizon in mid-January 1942, their eyes caught sight of what appeared to be a vast American fleet. Every detail, the alignment of ships, the cadence of radio transmissions, the shadows on the water, pointed to a force far larger than reality. Yet, what they did not know was that they were seeing the product of American ingenuity, deception crafted with precision, patience, and a deep understanding of human expectation. It was in this tension, this moment between perception and reality, that the stage was set for a confrontation that would shock Japanese captains and ripple across the Pacific, forcing a reevaluation of naval assumptions and heralding a new era of strategic deception. By late January 1942, the U.S. Navy's plan for deception fleets was fully operational. The concept, though not entirely new, had never been applied on such a scale in the Pacific. It was built around a combination of physical illusion, tactical misdirection, and controlled information flow. Wooden decoy ships, designed to resemble cruisers and carriers, were constructed at shipyards along the West Coast. Some were painted with false hull numbers and carrier markings, while others were fitted with fake superstructures to simulate air groups on deck. Even from a distance, these vessels could pass as operational warships. Escort ships, including destroyers and corvettes, accompanied these decoys to give the appearance of protection. Aircraft squadrons were briefed to conduct flyovers, circling the decoy fleets in patterns typical of reconnaissance or combat missions. Radio operators transmitted carefully crafted signals designed to imitate the orders, traffic, and timing of real carrier groups. Every element was choreographed to deceive. This operation required meticulous planning. Admiral William Halsey, commanding U.S. forces in the South Pacific, coordinated with intelligence officers and fleet captains. Reports of Japanese scouting flights were studied in detail to predict how the enemy would react. Planners knew that Japanese officers valued visual confirmation and had ingrained expectations about fleet formations and movements. By exploiting these tendencies, the Americans could project power without committing large numbers of actual capital ships. Meanwhile, Japanese reconnaissance faced limitations. Long-range patrol aircraft and scouts provided partial coverage, but weather, fuel constraints, and overextended supply lines meant that information was often incomplete. Japanese captains relied on experience and inference, sometimes filling gaps with assumptions. The intelligence process was vulnerable to manipulation, precisely what the Americans intended. On the morning of January 17th, the first Decoy fleet was sighted. From the bridge of the Japanese cruiser Chikuma, Captain Takeda observed what appeared to be a standard U.S. task force. The ships were spaced and aligned in a manner consistent with American naval doctrine, their silhouettes sharp against the horizon. A small escort of destroyers flanked the formation, just as a genuine carrier group would. Aircraft circling above completed the illusion, creating the impression of reconnaissance and air cover. For Japanese officers, the sighting was almost too perfect. Every element matched their expectations of an American strike group. The decoys exploited their confidence, making the fleet appear stronger and more numerous than reality. Even experienced captains hesitated to challenge the visual intelligence. Orders were delayed, reconnaissance reports rechecked, and radio transmissions scrutinized, all while the Americans silently manipulated the scene from hundreds of miles away. Technological factors amplified the deception. Radar coverage on Japanese ships was still limited, providing only partial confirmation of distant targets. Optical observations, the primary tool for identification, could be easily misled by the precise arrangement of decoy vessels and their supporting aircraft. Smoke generators, lights, and painted holes created the illusion of mass, while movements of small craft mimicked the operational patterns of a much larger fleet. Strategically, the impact was immediate. Japanese commanders, believing they faced a full-strength American force, shifted resources to counter a perceived threat. Decisions about ship positioning, offensive plans, and reserve deployments were all influenced by a false perception. Meanwhile, the real American carriers remained safely out of sight, protected by both geography and the layers of deception surrounding the decoy fleets. This careful orchestration demonstrated not only technological ingenuity, but also a deep understanding of human psychology and warfare. By creating a scenario in which the enemy could only act on limited and misleading information, the U.S. Navy achieved an advantage without risking direct engagement. The decoy fleet became a silent weapon, shaping enemy decisions and buying time for actual combat units to maneuver. By the afternoon, Japanese officers were fully convinced that they faced the vanguard of an American strike. Messages were relayed to higher command, reporting the apparent size, formation, and direction of the fleet. Each report, rooted in observation but influenced by illusion, reinforced the perception of overwhelming force. Captain Takeda, like his peers, could not yet see the subtle cues that revealed the truth: the gaps between ships, the absence of real aircraft, the slower-than-expected speeds. But those details would soon become apparent after decisions had already been made. The stage was set for confusion, misjudgment, and the first shock to Japanese naval planning. What appeared to be an encounter with overwhelming American strength was, in reality, a carefully constructed illusion, a decoy fleet designed to mislead, delay, and destabilize. And as Japanese captains adjusted their movements in response, the real fleets remained hidden, silently shaping the outcome of the Pacific War. For the Japanese captains observing the decoy fleets, the experience was unnervingly surreal. Officers who had spent decades at sea, seasoned in navigation and engagement, found themselves questioning what they saw. The horizon stretched with the silhouettes of seemingly formidable ships, each one perfectly positioned, each movement carefully timed. The human mind, conditioned to recognize patterns, struggled to reconcile the scale of the fleet with the limited reconnaissance reports. Captain Takeda's crew worked methodically, relaying sightings, scanning for signals, noting aircraft patterns. Yet every observation reinforced an illusion. Anxiety threaded through the ship. Hesitation became a natural response. Even minor inconsistencies, slightly slower movements, unusual aircraft formations, were rationalized as environmental factors or minor deviations, not as signs of deception. The psychological weight of command at sea is immense, and in this moment, the human factor became the most vulnerable link in Japanese decision-making. For American sailors and planners, the stakes were different. On board decoy vessels, crews executed their roles with precision, aware that any misstep could reveal the ruse. Even standing on what were essentially hollow wooden hulls, they understood the gravity of their task. They were performing a silent, dangerous act of psychological warfare without firing a shot, watching the enemy misread every cue. Tactically, the decoy fleets served a singular purpose: to shape enemy behavior. By presenting an illusion of strength in specific locations, American commanders forced Japanese officers to act defensively or reposition forces unnecessarily. This tactical manipulation achieved two critical outcomes. First, it diverted Japanese attention from the actual American carriers, which were operating elsewhere. Second, it slowed Japanese operational tempo, causing hesitation that could be exploited at a later stage. The decoy fleets were not static. Their movements followed carefully pre-planned routes. Destroyers flanked the wooden decoys, aircraft performed simulated patrol patterns, and radio transmissions imitated the cadence of real fleet orders. Every action was designed to suggest readiness for engagement. When Japanese reconnaissance observed these movements, they interpreted them as indicators of genuine combat intent, not as orchestrated misdirection. This approach highlights the importance of anticipation in naval warfare. The Americans did not need to directly challenge Japanese firepower. They only needed to make their presence felt convincingly enough to force errors in judgment. The battle was, in effect, being fought in the minds of Japanese officers before a single shot was fired. Technology was the invisible hand guiding this operation. While the decoy ships themselves were simple constructs, the use of radar, radio, and optical illusion magnified their effectiveness. Wooden ships were painted with false superstructures, mimicking carriers' flight decks from a distance. Smoke generators simulated active engines, while the precise timing of movements gave the impression of operational readiness. Radio traffic was equally critical. Operators transmitted messages consistent with actual carrier groups, including false position reports and routine operational chatter. Japanese intelligence, relying on intercepted signals, interpreted these communications as genuine fleet movements. Even radar, which could detect mass and motion, was misled by the calculated spacing and configuration of the decoy vessels. Aircraft contributed to the illusion as well. Patrol planes circled decoy fleets in patterns consistent with scouting or air cover missions. From above, Japanese observers could see formations, take note of flight activity, and assume they were witnessing a real force. The convergence of simple engineering, communications trickery, and aerial maneuvering created a convincing tableau of American strength, demonstrating that technology need not always be offensive to be decisive. It could also deceive. At the highest levels, leadership shaped the outcomes long before ships ever exchanged fire. Admiral Yamamoto, commanding the Japanese combined fleet, relied on reports from scouts and captains to make strategic judgments. When news arrived of what appeared to be a massive American task force near the Solomon Islands, he faced a dilemma: act aggressively and risk overextension, or exercise caution and potentially allow the enemy to dictate the tempo of operations. Meanwhile, American leaders embraced the uncertainty they had created. Admiral Chester Nimitz and Admiral William Halsey understood that the decoy fleets could buy time and manipulate Japanese deployments without committing actual capital ships. Every maneuver, every broadcast, every staged aerial sortie was approved at the highest levels, a deliberate orchestration of perception. Leadership was not merely about tactical brilliance, it was psychological. By controlling what the enemy believed to be true, American commanders shaped decisions on the other side of the ocean without firing a shot. This contrast between leadership styles highlights a critical principle in warfare. Uncertainty is a weapon. Yamamoto's need for accurate information became a vulnerability, while Nimitz and Halsey leveraged ambiguity to gain a strategic advantage. Japanese intelligence was sophisticated but not infallible. Reconnaissance planes reported fleet sightings, radio intercepts suggested American movements, and pattern recognition led to the assumption that the largest signals indicated the most critical forces. Yet this reliance on expectations became a trap. The decoy fleets exploited Japanese confidence and procedural habits, presenting exactly the type of information they were trained to trust. From the perspective of Japanese captains, every visual confirmation and radio report seemed to validate prior assumptions. Reports of large formations, perfectly spaced ships, and simulated air cover created the illusion of overwhelming force. The enemy's own efficiency and discipline, normally an advantage, made the deception more convincing. By believing what they were trained to see, Japanese officers became victims of their own methods. This failure of perception delayed Japanese decision-making, diverted resources, and created openings elsewhere in the Pacific. The decoy fleet was not simply a distraction. It was a trap crafted from the enemy's own procedures and assumptions. Beyond tactics and technology, the use of decoy fleets had profound moral and strategic implications. For the Japanese, the psychological impact was immediate. Confusion, doubt, and hesitation began to erode confidence in command judgments. Even experienced captains questioned their reconnaissance, their instincts, and the reliability of their intelligence networks. In the Pacific, where the speed of decision could mean life or death for ships and crews, this uncertainty was deadly. For the Americans, the operation demonstrated that warfare could extend beyond conventional measures of firepower. Morale, perception, and misdirection were now tools of strategy. The decoy fleets required no direct combat to achieve results, yet they had the effect of reshaping enemy deployments, buying precious time, and preserving actual combat assets for decisive engagement. The operation blurred the line between physical and psychological battlefields, proving that innovation and cunning could rival brute force in effectiveness. Strategically, these decoys forced Japanese planners to reconsider assumptions about American operational capacity. If a fleet could appear so convincing without being real, what else might the Americans be hiding? This planted seeds of caution and doubt that would echo throughout subsequent campaigns in the Pacific, influencing decisions at both tactical and operational levels. January 17th, 1942, mid-afternoon. The sea was deceptively calm, a slate-gray mirror reflecting the sky. On board the Japanese cruiser Chikuma, Captain Takeda peered through the periscope, watching the approaching formation of American ships. Every detail seemed authentic. The spacing of the vessels, the patterns of their aircraft overhead, even the wakes in the water. It was, by every measure, a formidable fleet. Yet it was an illusion. Across the Pacific, the real American carriers remained hidden hundreds of miles away, while decoy fleets moved with deliberate precision. Wooden hulls mimicked cruisers, false flight decks suggested operational carriers, and aircraft flew pre-programmed circuits above the vessels. Radio transmissions, carefully scripted, reiterated the presence of an actual task force. Japanese reconnaissance pilots reported sightings, convinced they had located the core of American power. Captain Takeda, relying on experience and training, transmitted updates to Admiral Yamamoto. Each message described significant enemy strength, providing coordinates and estimated numbers. The reports carried authority. The formations looked real. Yet beneath the surface, the decoys remained hollow, their crews executing the performance of combat-ready ships. The tactical implications became immediate. Japanese commanders, believing they faced the vanguard of the American Pacific Fleet, adjusted deployments to counter a threat that did not exist. Destroyers were detached to shadow the decoy force. Air patrols were redirected to provide reconnaissance and early warning. Carrier groups were repositioned to avoid what they assumed would be an impending strike. Every decision was shaped by the false narrative constructed hundreds of miles away. At 15:30, a scout plane reported additional reinforcements joining the American formation. Captain Takeda's crew interpreted the sighting as confirmation of the enemy's overwhelming strength. Officers convened on the bridge, debating whether to engage or hold position. Confidence wavered, tension mounting as each moment stretched the gap between perception and reality. Meanwhile, the American decoy planners monitored the Japanese reactions from distant command posts. Every maneuver, hesitation, and misjudgment was observed, logged, and anticipated. The decoy fleets were not passive. They were active instruments of influence, shaping enemy decisions with precision. American leadership had designed the illusion to maximize psychological impact without risking lives or ships. The first subtle errors began to appear in Japanese coordination. Miscommunications arose as conflicting reports of fleet composition spread through command channels. One division, expecting an attack on a different axis, delayed its movement. Another, convinced the decoy fleet represented the main threat, committed fuel and ordnance to shadowing maneuvers. The chain of command strained under the weight of incomplete and misleading information. By late afternoon, the illusion reached its peak. From a distance, the decoy fleets appeared to form a crescent around what Japanese officers assumed was a carrier corps. Smoke plumes, moving aircraft, and orchestrated naval spacing created an unmistakable impression of mass and readiness. Captain Takeda, interpreting these signs, transmitted urgent requests for reinforcements. His tone, though calm, betrayed concern. The perceived American strength was now threatening the operational integrity of the Japanese fleet in the region. The decoy operation achieved its critical objective. It forced the enemy to react to a fiction as though it were reality. Japanese forces were now committed to a set of maneuvers based entirely on deception. Any subsequent engagement would be shaped by the misperceptions created during these hours. Strategic momentum, normally a function of numerical and technological superiority, had been influenced through illusion. Yet within the Japanese command, questions began to flicker. Some officers noted the absence of certain key signals that should accompany a real carrier group. Aircraft activity, while present, lacked the intensity of a true operational strike. Small inconsistencies hinted at the possibility of deception, but these doubts were delayed, suppressed by the weight of earlier observations and the fear of misjudgment. As dusk approached, the tension remained unresolved. The decoy fleets, seemingly static and formidable, had created a window in which American real forces could maneuver freely, repositioning to exploit Japanese miscalculations. The stage was set for the next critical moments, the unfolding of a confrontation in which reality and illusion would collide, and the shock of discovery would redefine Japanese operational expectations in the Pacific. As night began to fall on January 17th, 1942, the Japanese fleet remained locked in a web of misperception. The decoy formation, still outwardly imposing under fading sunlight, had successfully diverted attention from the real American carriers, which were now repositioning under cover of distance and darkness. Japanese captains, convinced of the threat directly ahead, debated tactical options, unaware that their every calculation had been shaped by deception. By 1800 hours, Japanese reconnaissance aircraft reported strange gaps between carrier vessels, but Captain Takeda and his colleagues rationalized these anomalies as operational errors or reconnaissance misinterpretations. No one yet considered that these gaps indicated empty hulls and false decks. Meanwhile, American decoy ships continued their carefully choreographed maneuvers, maintaining formations that suggested readiness for immediate engagement. The illusion of mass persisted even as the sun dipped below the horizon. The psychological pressure on Japanese command intensified. Orders were issued to concentrate forces along predicted American attack vectors, committing ships and aircraft to positions dictated entirely by false information. Entire divisions shifted in response to phantom threats, consuming fuel, ammunition, and precious operational time. A single misstep could have exposed the fleet, yet the enemy's hesitation ensured that no direct confrontation occurred. At 2000 hours, a scout plane finally reported signs that did not match standard carrier operations. Observers noted the absence of catapult launches, minimal aircraft traffic, and slower-than-expected maneuvers. Some junior officers began to voice concerns. Captain Takeda hesitated, unsure whether these discrepancies were errors, deception, or natural irregularities in fleet movements. Meanwhile, American commanders monitored reactions, careful not to reveal the true position of their actual carriers. Every Japanese decision confirmed the effectiveness of the ruse. By 2100 hours, the realization began to dawn on the Japanese high command. They had been misled. Reports of American forces were inconsistent. Estimates of strength fluctuated wildly. While no engagement had occurred, the strategic impact was already clear. Forces had been misallocated, positions compromised, and plans delayed, all without a single shell fired. The decoy fleet had rewritten the operational map in real time. The culmination of the operation came with the first sightings of the actual American carriers at dawn on January 18th. Japanese commanders, now adjusting to the unexpected reality, faced a fleet in positions they had not anticipated. Strategic momentum had shifted, and American forces retained the initiative. The shock experienced by Japanese captains was profound. The fleet they had believed in so strongly, visible, tangible, threatening, was largely an illusion, while the true threat had maneuvered undetected. In tactical terms, the decoy fleet had achieved an extraordinary victory without combat. Japanese forces, though intact, were forced into a reactive posture, their operational freedom constrained by the very deception they had failed to detect. Commanders who had prided themselves on anticipation and decisiveness now faced the bitter lesson that perception, carefully manipulated, could be as powerful as firepower. The operational implications rippled through the Japanese Navy. Decisions made during those critical hours, deploying aircraft, repositioning destroyers, diverting reconnaissance, had been dictated by what did not exist. Even after realizing the truth, the momentum had shifted. American forces could strike on their terms, choosing targets and timing with precision. The decoy fleets had accomplished what traditional naval engagement might not have, shaping enemy behavior in advance, creating conditions for tactical and strategic advantage before battle had even begun. In broader terms, this event illustrated a turning point in naval warfare. The ability to mislead, confuse, and manipulate through controlled perception became a force multiplier. Psychological operations, camouflage, and deception emerged as legitimate instruments of strategic power, altering assumptions about what constituted strength at sea. The shock experienced by Japanese captains would linger, influencing decision-making and instilling caution in future encounters across the Pacific theater. By the end of January 18th, the Decoy fleets had vanished into the Pacific expanse, leaving behind confusion, misallocated resources, and a humbled Japanese command. For the Americans, the operation was a resounding success, a demonstration of ingenuity, patience, and the power of deception. For the Japanese, it was a lesson in the dangers of overconfidence and the vulnerability of even the most experienced officers to the manipulation of perception. The stage was now set for the aftermath, where the consequences of these hours of illusion would ripple through the Pacific War, affecting strategy, morale, and the trajectory of future engagements. In the days following January 17th to 18th, 1942, the immediate consequences of the Decoy fleet operation became clear. Japanese commanders were forced to reevaluate what they had observed, replaying reports, maps, and radio intercepts in search of errors. From the high command in Tokyo to the bridges of individual cruisers, confusion lingered. Entire divisions had been redeployed, consuming fuel, ammunition, and operational reserves in response to a threat that had never existed. While no ships were sunk during this episode, the psychological impact was significant. Officers who had relied on sight, experience, and training now realized the limits of perception. Captain Takeda himself admitted in later debriefs that the Decoy fleet had appeared far stronger than reality, forcing decisions that may have risked our positions unnecessarily. Similar reports from other commanders noted hesitation, misallocation of forces, and a profound sense of being outmaneuvered without engagement. The operation also revealed weaknesses in Japanese reconnaissance. Scouts had identified ships and aircraft, but their assessments lacked depth and critical details, such as the absence of operational aircraft on the supposed carriers, were overlooked. Radar capabilities were limited, optical confirmation was misleading, and assumptions filled in the gaps. The U.S. Navy had exploited these vulnerabilities, demonstrating that perception could dictate strategic outcomes without firing a single shot. For the Americans, the success was both immediate and strategic. Real carriers remained intact, positioned for future operations, while Japanese forces had been manipulated into defensive postures. The operation provided an early template for psychological warfare in naval campaigns. The ability to shape enemy movements, create hesitation, and force misallocation of resources through deception alone. Beyond the immediate tactical gains, the Decoy fleets sent a message across the Pacific. Japanese leadership, long confident in the superiority of their naval doctrine and the reliability of their intelligence, faced an unsettling truth. Appearances could no longer be trusted. A fleet's size, formation, and apparent readiness might be a carefully orchestrated illusion, capable of dictating strategy as effectively as real ships and guns. Casualty reports from the Japanese side were non-existent in this engagement, but the strategic costs were measurable. Fuel reserves had been spent repositioning ships, aircraft patrols had been diverted from other operational priorities, and decision-making time was lost. In several instances, the distraction of the Decoy fleets delayed Japanese plans for offensive operations, giving American forces critical breathing space to consolidate, repair, and prepare for the next phase of the Pacific campaign. At the human level, the operation left an indelible mark. Officers who had relied on intuition and observation felt betrayed by their senses. The Decoy fleets demonstrated that in modern naval warfare, information and the manipulation of perception was as crucial as firepower. Confidence and experience, though invaluable, could be turned into liabilities when the enemy understood how to control what was seen and believed. This psychological ripple extended beyond immediate commands. Rumors of phantom fleets circulated among the ranks. Some Japanese sailors began questioning the reliability of intelligence reports and the competence of their reconnaissance teams. The shock of realizing they had been deceived would echo in subsequent campaigns, influencing decisions at both tactical and operational levels. By the end of the week, the full picture emerged. The decoy fleets had performed their intended function with precision. They had diverted attention, misled command, and preserved American strength for future engagements. The psychological edge gained in these hours exemplified a new form of warfare, one where ingenuity and perception could alter the balance of power as dramatically as cannon or torpedo. The events of January 17th to 18th did not conclude the story of the Pacific War. Yet the aftereffects of the decoy fleet operation, hesitation, misjudgment, and the forced recalibration of Japanese strategy set in motion a series of consequences that would influence subsequent battles, carrier operations, and intelligence practices across the theater. The next section will examine the longer-term consequences, strategic shifts, verified operational reports, and the enduring lessons of deception that shaped the Pacific War. By early February 1942, the broader consequences of the decoy fleet operation were evident across the Pacific theater. Japanese Naval Command, still grappling with the implications of being misled, took stock of the operational disruptions caused by what they now recognized as a deliberate ruse. Fleet movements had been redirected, patrol routes altered, and reserve forces committed unnecessarily, all without the Americans engaging directly. Admiral Yamamoto's staff documented the event in internal reports, acknowledging that intelligence had been manipulated. One debrief noted, enemy formations observed on January 17th appeared substantial. Subsequent verification reveals a large portion were false. Operational plans executed under this misperception may have compromised our flexibility. These words reflect a rare admission. The Japanese have been outmaneuvered not through firepower, but through strategic deception. The immediate tactical consequences were mirrored in operational readiness. Fuel stocks were depleted as ships were sent to shadow decoy fleets. Aircraft sorties were diverted to monitor non-existent threats, and destroyers assigned to screening duties were temporarily unavailable for other missions. Even minor adjustments, shifting cruisers or reallocating carrier escorts, added cumulative strain to an already overstretched Japanese supply chain. In a theater where logistics could determine the outcome of a campaign, these disruptions were significant. Psychologically, the decoy operation planted doubt and caution in Japanese decision-making. Commanders who had relied on pattern recognition and visual confirmation now faced the unsettling reality that appearances could be deliberately deceptive. The Pacific War was no longer a contest of raw force alone. It had evolved into a contest of perception and intelligence. For officers like Captain Takeda, the shock lingered, influencing tactical choices in subsequent encounters and fostering a heightened sense of skepticism toward reconnaissance reports. Strategically, the decoy fleets validated American doctrine that innovation and ingenuity could offset numerical or experiential disadvantages. By simulating strength, the U.S. Navy preserved its real capital ships for future operations while simultaneously forcing the Japanese to commit resources to a phantom threat. The operation demonstrated a new dimension of naval warfare, the ability to shape the enemy's decisions before a shot was fired. This principle would underpin later campaigns, including more sophisticated feints and deception tactics employed throughout the Solomon Islands, the Coral Sea, and Midway. Casualty figures from this episode were negligible. No vessels were lost, and no sailors were killed in the decoy engagement. Yet the strategic losses inflicted on the Japanese were measurable. Operational time was squandered, positions were compromised, and critical planning windows were disrupted. In warfare, such intangible losses, hesitation, misjudgment, and misallocation, can be as decisive as kinetic victory. The event also influenced Japanese doctrine and intelligence practices. Commanders reviewed reconnaissance procedures, radar integration, and verification protocols, seeking to prevent future deceptions. Yet the lesson of January 17th to 18th endured. Even the most disciplined fleet could be manipulated through illusion. The Americans had demonstrated that deception, carefully executed, could impose constraints on an opponent far more effectively than direct engagement. In the larger context of the Pacific War, the Decoy fleet operation represented a subtle but pivotal turning point. While not a battle in the conventional sense, it exemplified a shift in naval strategy, where perception, psychology, and information manipulation became as critical as gunnery or maneuvering. It foreshadowed later operations in which intelligence, code-breaking, and feints would decide the outcomes of entire campaigns. By the end of February, the shockwaves of the Decoy fleets had settled, but the memory of the operation persisted in Japanese naval planning. Officers approached reconnaissance with increased caution. Command decisions were tempered by doubt, and the awareness of American ingenuity left a lasting impression. The stage was set for subsequent engagements in which American forces, combining deception with actual strength, could exploit the psychological and tactical advantage gained through ingenuity and careful planning. Thus, the Decoy fleet episode illustrates a fundamental principle of modern warfare. Victory is not achieved solely by physical dominance, but also through mastery of perception, timing, and the manipulation of enemy expectations. It was a subtle, silent triumph that reverberated far beyond the horizon of January 1942, shaping the Pacific theater in ways Japanese commanders would feel for months to come. Strategically, the Decoy fleets validated American doctrine that innovation and ingenuity could offset numerical or experiential disadvantages. By simulating strength, the U.S. Navy preserved its real capital ships for future operations while simultaneously forcing the Japanese to commit resources to a phantom threat. The operation demonstrated a new dimension of naval warfare, the ability to shape the enemy's decisions before a shot was fired. This principle would underpin later campaigns, including more sophisticated feints and deception tactics employed throughout the Solomon Islands, the Coral Sea, and Midway. Casualty figures from this episode were negligible. No vessels were lost, and no sailors were killed in the Decoy engagement. Yet the strategic losses inflicted on the Japanese were measurable. Operational time was squandered, positions were compromised, and critical planning windows were disrupted. In warfare, such intangible losses, hesitation, misjudgment, and misallocation, can be as decisive as kinetic victory. The event also influenced Japanese doctrine and intelligence practices. Commanders reviewed reconnaissance procedures, radar integration, and verification protocols, seeking to prevent future deceptions. Yet the lesson of January 17th to 18th endured. Even the most disciplined fleet could be manipulated through illusion. The Americans had demonstrated that deception, carefully executed, could impose constraints on an opponent far more effectively than direct engagement. In a larger context of the Pacific War, the Decoy fleet operation represented a subtle but pivotal turning point. While not a battle in the conventional sense, it exemplified a shift in naval strategy, where perception, psychology, and information manipulation became as critical as gunnery or maneuvering. It foreshadowed later operations in which intelligence, code-breaking, and feints would decide the outcomes of entire campaigns. By the end of February, the shockwaves of the decoy fleets had settled, but the memory of the operation persisted in Japanese naval planning. Officers approached reconnaissance with increased caution. Command decisions were tempered by doubt, and the awareness of American ingenuity left a lasting impression. The stage was set for subsequent engagements in which American forces, combining deception with actual strength, could exploit the psychological and tactical advantage gained through ingenuity and careful planning. Thus, the Decoy Fleet episode illustrates a fundamental principle of modern warfare. Victory is not achieved solely by physical dominance, but also through mastery of perception, timing, and the manipulation of enemy expectations. It was a subtle, silent triumph that reverberated far beyond the horizon of January 1942, shaping the Pacific theater in ways Japanese commanders would feel for months to come. The decoy fleets of January 1942 stand as a testament to the power of perception in warfare. No shells were fired, no ships were sunk, yet the operation reshaped the Pacific theater. What unfolded was not a conventional battle, but a confrontation of minds, an encounter in which illusion became as decisive as steel. For Japanese captains, the shock was profound. Their training, experience, and intuition had been outmaneuvered by ingenuity, patience, and careful observation of human behavior. The episode illustrates a fundamental shift in naval strategy. Warfare is no longer determined solely by firepower or numbers. It is shaped by information, psychology, and the ability to manipulate what an opponent believes to be true. The Americans had turned perception into a weapon, crafting a scenario in which the enemy's decisions were guided by fiction, yet treated as reality. This approach would echo throughout the Pacific War, influencing campaigns at Coral Sea, Midway, and beyond, where deception, feints, and intelligence became integral to success. At a human level, the decoy fleet operation reminds us of the limits of certainty. Even the most seasoned officers can be misled when reality is filtered through expectation and assumption. Confidence, while essential, can be exploited. In warfare, as in life, the unseen, what is suggested, implied, or feigned, can carry consequences equal to what is tangible. Ultimately, the story of the decoy fleets is one of restraint and creativity triumphing over brute force. It is a reminder that innovation often emerges from necessity, that strategy is as much about timing and perception as about firepower, and that the imagination of commanders can be a decisive instrument in conflict. In the waters of the Pacific, where vast distances magnified uncertainty and every decision carried weight, the Americans demonstrated that mastery over illusion could achieve results that might otherwise have required years of attrition and countless lives. The decoy fleets were invisible victories, fleeting shadows on the horizon that left an indelible mark on history. They reveal the profound truth that in war, as in history itself, what the enemy believes can be as powerful as what actually exists.